The crack of bone echoed louder than the hum of the gravity generators. Dust settled over the sparring mat, catching the harsh fluorescent lights. A boy lay motionless, his breath rattling through a crushed rib cage. Above him stood a giant clad in natural armor, casually adjusting a training gauntlet. Silence suffocated the arena. No sirens wailed, no medics rushed forward. Just the mechanical ticking of the countdown clock and the heavy, ragged exhale of the girl watching from the shadows. The air in the Orbital Academy's gymnasium always tasted like tin and stale sweat. It was a sterile, manufactured atmosphere, recycled through heavy industrial scrubbers that couldn't quite mask the underlying odor of ammonia, the natural scent of the larger, kitten-plated recruits when their body temperatures rose. Jess sat on a cold steel bench, peeling a strip of athletic tape from her wrist. She hated the tape. It left a sticky residue that trapped the abrasive dust of the training mats against her skin. She hated the mats, too. They were designed to absorb impacts from species that weighed 3 times what a human did, which meant falling on them felt like hitting solid concrete coated in sandpaper. Beside her, Leo was vibrating. He wasn't literally shaking, but the nervous energy radiating off him made the bench hum. He was adjusting the straps of his synthetic chest plate for the 5th time in 3 minutes. "Stop it," Jess said. Her voice was flat, carrying the low rasp of someone who had swallowed too much dry air. "You're going to snap the buckle, then they'll charge you for it." "It's too loose," Leo muttered. He pulled the nylon strap sharply. The plastic buckle squeaked in protest. "Bronson said full contact today. No kinetic dampeners." Bronson says a lot of things to hear his own voice echo inside that massive, ugly skull of his. Jess tossed the crumpled ball of tape into a nearby incinerator chute. It vanished with a soft thump. She leaned back, pressing her shoulder blades against the freezing wall, and closed her eyes. They were the only 2 humans in Sector 4. The rest of the recruits were a mix of heavy worlders, bipedal mountains of muscle and dense bone covered in thick, leathery hides, or rigid exoskeletons. The Coalition called them standard form. Humans, by contrast, were classified as fragile, high risk. It was a bureaucratic label that made getting health clearance a nightmare. Jess didn't care about the labels. She was here because the Coalition paid in hard credits, and hard credits bought passage out of the industrial smog of Earth's lower sectors. Leo was here because he actually believed the brochures. He thought the Coalition stood for unity exploration and the betterment of the galaxy. He was an idiot, a sweet, optimistic, infuriating idiot. Heavy footsteps vibrated through the floorboards. The rhythm was deliberate. Thud. Pause. Thud. Jess opened one eye. Commander Bronson stepped onto the central mat. He stood 7 feet tall, his body a monument to predatory evolution. Thick grey-blue plates overlapped across his chest and shoulders, acting as natural armor. His face was flat, dominated by a wide jaw and 4 deep-set, pitch-black eyes. He smelled strongly of ozone and that sharp ammonia tang. Recruits. Bronson's voice was a low mechanical grind projected through a translator collar that couldn't quite smooth out the guttural clicks of his native language. Combat is not a negotiation. It is a mathematical equation. Mass velocity and leverage. He paced the perimeter of the mat. His heavy 3-toed boots left faint scuff marks on the grey polymer surface. "The Coalition standardizes our weaponry," Bronson continued. "It does not standardize our bodies. Some of you are built for war." His black eyes swept over the massive recruits in the front row. Wyatt, a hulking brute with ridges down his spine, puffed his chest out. Bronson's gaze shifted to the back corner, to the steel bench. "And some of you are built for administration. Today we demonstrate the difference." Jess felt a familiar cold knot tighten in her stomach. It wasn't fear. It was exhaustion. She knew exactly where this was going. She nudged Leo with her elbow. "Take a dive," she whispered, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor. Leo blinked, turning his head. "What?" "When he calls you. Take a dive. Let him hit your guard. Fall back. Stay down. Do not try to prove a point." "I can hold my own, Jess. I've been practicing the pivot." "Leo." Jess turned to look at him. She saw the pale, clammy sheen of sweat on his forehead, the slight tremor in his jaw. "You weigh 160 pounds. He weighs 600. Math, velocity, leverage, fall down." "Leo," Bronson barked. The translator collar amplified the name, sending it echoing off the high vaulted ceiling. "Front and center." Leo swallowed hard. The sound was audible in the sudden silence of the gym. He stood up his boots, feeling too heavy for his legs. He stepped onto the mat. Jess stayed on the bench. She crossed her arms, digging her fingernails into the fabric of her uniform sleeves. The fabric was rough. It scratched against her skin. She focused on that sensation. The scratch, the cold wall behind her, the ticking of the digital clock on the far wall. Just fall down, Leo. Just fall down. The mat felt entirely too large as Leo walked to the center. Bronson didn't take a combat stance. He simply stood there, his massive arms hanging at his sides, thick joints popping as he flexed his segmented fingers. "Attack," Bronson commanded. Leo hesitated. He raised his fists, settling into a standard boxing guard. It looked laughably small against the sheer width of the commander. Leo shifted his weight, his rubber soles squeaking against the polymer mat. He threw a quick jab, aiming for the softer tissue beneath Bronson's chin. The punch landed with a dull smack. It was like punching a tire wall. Bronson didn't even blink. "Pathetic," Bronson grunted. Before Leo could retract his arm, Bronson moved. For a creature so massive, the speed was jarring, a grey-blue blur. Bronson's hand clamped around Leo's wrist. Jess stopped breathing. Her fingernails dug deeper into her sleeves, breaking the skin. Bronson yanked Leo forward off balance and drove his other fist into Leo's chest plate. The synthetic armor, designed to distribute kinetic energy, folded inward with a sickening crunch. Leo's feet left the ground. He flew backward, sliding across the abrasive mat for 5 feet before coming to a halt. He groaned, rolling onto his side. "Stay down," Jess thought. "Stay down, you stupid kid." But Leo was gasping, trying to drag oxygen past bruised lungs. His pride, that stupid, idealistic human pride, made him push himself up onto his knees. He spat a wad of saliva onto the mat. "I said stay down," Jess muttered under her breath, the words tasting like copper. Bronson walked slowly toward the kneeling boy. "The equation fails when the variables are weak," the commander announced to the watching recruits. "The human structure is porous, water and calcium. It crumbles under pressure." Bronson raised his heavy boot and planted it squarely on the center of Leo's back, pressing him flat against the mat. Leo let out a sharp, breathless yelp. "Tap out," Jess whispered. Her right leg began to bounce, a rapid, uncontrollable tremor. She hated making scenes. She hated drawing attention. Survival in the lower sectors meant staying invisible. You didn't look the gangs in the eye. You didn't talk back to the peacekeepers. You kept your head down, you earned your chits, and you minded your own business. "Yield," Bronson ordered, applying more pressure. Leo's hands scrabbled against the mat, fingers curling into tight fists. "No," he choked out. Jess closed her eyes. "Idiot." Bronson shifted his weight. The sound was distinct. A wet, hollow snap like stepping on a dry branch wrapped in a wet towel. Leo didn't scream. The air left him in a ragged, high-pitched wheeze, and his body went entirely limp. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the mechanical whir of the environmental scrubbers. Bronson removed his foot. He looked down at the motionless boy, then turned his back. Medical, he grunted toward a cadet by the door. Remove the debris. Jess didn't make a conscious decision to move. Her brain was screaming at her to sit still. It's not your problem. You'll lose your stipend. You'll get thrown in the brig. Sit down. But her body was already in motion. The cold air rushed past her face. The rough texture of the mat was suddenly beneath her boots. Commander, Jess said. Her voice wasn't a shout. It was low, quiet, and carried a strange, vibrating intensity. Bronson paused, turning his heavy head to look over his armored shoulder. Return to your seat, recruit. Jess kept walking. She stepped over the boundary line, the faint, static charge of the perimeter sensors prickling the hairs on her arms. She didn't look at Leo. She couldn't. If she looked at the awkward angle of his ribcage, she would lose whatever cold, detached anchor was keeping her rational. She stopped 3 feet from Bronson. The size difference was absurd. She had to tilt her head all the way back, just to see his deep-set black eyes. He yielded, Jess said. He did not vocalize a yield, Bronson countered, turning fully to face her. He failed the equation. You broke his ribs after he was neutralized. Jess's hands hung loosely at her sides. She could feel the pulse in her fingertips. Fast, rhythmic. Bronson stepped closer, towering over her. The smell of ammonia was suffocating. Are you challenging an instructor? Human, I'm telling you, Jess said, her voice dropping another octave, that you're a bully who likes breaking cheap toys. Bronson moved. It was the same backhand strike he had used on Leo, a sweeping arc of dense bone and muscle designed to clear a perimeter. Jess didn't try to block it. Blocking a moving mass of 600 pounds with a human forearm would snap her ulna in 2. Instead, she stepped into the strike. She ducked her head, tucking her chin to her chest, and let the heavy armored forearm slide past her shoulder, grazing her ear. The friction burned like fire, tearing the skin off the top of her ear. The force of the near miss spun her slightly, but she kept her feet planted. Bronson's eyes widened, a flicker of confusion registering on his flat face. He had overcommitted to the swing, assuming she would retreat. She didn't retreat. The adrenaline hit Jess's system like a toxic chemical burn. It tasted metallic at the back of her throat. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel, the edges blurring into static. As Bronson's arm swung past her, extending his heavily armored shoulder joint, Jess moved. She reached up with both hands, her fingers wrapping around the thick, ridged wrist of his extended arm. Earth gravity was 9.8 meters per second squared. Bronson's home world was a fraction of that. His people evolved dense armor to protect against predators, but underneath the chitin, their muscle fibers were designed for low-resistance environments. Humans didn't have armor. Humans had density, packed, tightly coiled muscle fibers built to push back against a planet that constantly tried to crush them. Jess planted her boots wide, feeling the rubber grip the mat. She didn't try to pull him. She used his own forward momentum. She twisted her hips, dropping her center of gravity low, locking his arm against her shoulder like a fulcrum. "Let go," Bronson growled, trying to rip his arm back. The pull was immense. It lifted Jess onto her toes, straining her back muscles fire, shooting down her spine. But she held on. Her knuckles turned white. The rough plates of his armor sliced into her palms, drawing warm, wet lines across her skin. He yanked again, harder. Jess let him pull, but she shifted her leverage, stepping behind his front knee. As he pulled back, she drove her weight down and twisted violently in the opposite direction. The human body in distress is a terrifying engine. It ignores safety limiters. It burns muscle tissue for fuel. Jess roared, not a battle cry, but a guttural, ugly sound of sheer exertion. She threw her entire body weight into the twist, pulling his arm downward while his momentum went backward. The alien joint wasn't designed to bend that way. The first sound was a thick, wet pop. Bronson let out a deafening screech, a sound like tearing metal that bypassed the translator collar entirely. His knees buckled as the structural integrity of his shoulder gave way. But Jess couldn't stop. The biological switch had been flipped. Her brain wasn't processing logic. It was processing survival. The threat was still moving. The threat needed to be dismantled. She braced her foot against his ribcage as he fell. She leaned back, her back muscles screaming, tearing microscopic fibers. The thick tendons connecting Bronson's arm to his torso began to snap. It sounded like thick nylon ropes parting under extreme tension. Snap, snap, tear. Dark, viscous fluid smelling sharply of copper and rotting fruit sprayed across Jess's face and chest. It was warm. It blinded her left eye. With a final sickening sound of separating cartilage, the resistance vanished. Jess stumbled backward, falling hard onto her backside on the mat. She gasped for air, her lungs burning her heart, hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The gym was dead silent. Even the environmental scrubbers seemed to have stopped. Jess blinked, wiping the dark fluid from her eye with a shaking wrist. Her hands felt heavy. Too heavy. She looked down. She was still holding Bronson's arm. It was massive ending in a ragged, bloody stump of torn muscle and shattered chitin. It weighed easily 60 pounds. 10 feet away, Bronson was on the floor, convulsing in shock, a pool of dark fluid spreading rapidly across the grey mat from the cavernous wound in his shoulder. Jess sat there, the adrenaline receding, leaving behind a cold, nauseating reality. Her hands were shaking violently. Her palms were sliced open, bleeding over the alien armor she clutched. She dropped the severed limb. It hit the mat with a wet, heavy thud. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt sick. Her stomach heaved, and she turned to the side, dry heaving onto the mat, the smell of ozone ammonia and alien blood overwhelming her senses. Slowly she looked up. Every recruit in the room was staring at her. Wyatt, the hulking brute from the front row, had backed up against the wall, his eyes wide, his jaw slack. Jess wiped her mouth with the back of her trembling hand. She ignored them all. She crawled on her hands and knees, the rough mat tearing at her skin until she reached Leo. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow, a thin line of red running from the corner of his mouth. Jess sat beside him. She didn't look back at the bleeding commander. She didn't look at the terrified recruits. She just sat in the pool of alien fluids, her hands shaking, waiting for the sirens to finally start wailing. The security response was deafening, yet Jess barely registered the noise. It was a blur of heavy boots, flashing amber hazard lights, and the crackle of localized comms. 4 coalition peacekeepers, hulking reptilian bipedals of the same genetic stock as Bronson, surrounded her. They didn't bark orders to stand down. They didn't rush her. They approached with their kinetic rifles drawn and their shoulders hunched in a defensive posture. Their heavy, unblinking eyes darted from the severed limb on the mat to the small, blood-soaked human sitting quietly beside her unconscious friend. "Hands behind your head," the lead peacekeeper ordered. The translator collar clipped his words into sharp, metallic syllables. His weapon was pointed squarely at her chest. Jess didn't look up. She was staring at Leo's chest, watching the shallow, erratic rise and fall of his broken ribs. Her own body was beginning to shut down. The adrenaline was receding, leaving a toxic, freezing hollow in her stomach. Her teeth began to chatter. A fine, uncontrollable tremor rattled her shoulders. "I said hands behind your head." The peacekeeper stepped closer, his boots splashing lightly in the pool of dark, viscous fluid. Slowly Jess raised her arms. The movement pulled at her back. A sharp, blinding pain lanced up her spine, wrapping around her rib cage. Her latissimus muscles felt like they had been shredded with a cheese grater. She let out a short, involuntary hiss of air, her fingers slipping into her matted, sweat-soaked hair. 2 of the guards moved in. They didn't grab her by the arms, they didn't touch her at all. One of them tossed a pair of kinetic cuffs onto her wrists. The heavy metal rings snapped shut automatically with a loud clack, locking her hands together with a magnetic field, so strong it made the iron in her blood throb. They hauled her to her feet by the cuffs. Her knees buckled for a second, rubbery and useless, but she caught herself. She didn't want them dragging her. As they marched her out of the gymnasium, a medical team rushed in past them, pushing a hover gurney. Jess turned her head, straining against the guard's grip to watch them lift Leo. His head lolled to the side. The red line at the corner of his mouth had thickened. "Keep moving," a guard grunted, shoving her forward. The walk to the holding sector was a sensory nightmare. The bright, sterile lights of the academy corridors pierced her retinas. Recruits from other sectors, elegant avian species, towering, silicates other humans, pressed against the walls as the security detail marched her past. They stared. Jess kept her eyes glued to the scuffed floor panels. She could smell herself. The rancid, fruity copper of Bronson's blood was drying on her skin, tightening like a mask across the left side of her face. Her palms were still bleeding, the warm droplets sliding down her wrists to pool inside the kinetic cuffs. They reached the brig. A heavy blast door slid open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a featureless grey box of a cell. No windows. No bed. Just a cold steel bench bolted to the floor, and a grated drain in the center of the room. A guard shoved her inside. She stumbled, hitting the floor hard on her knees. The blast door slammed shut behind her. The magnetic field in her cuffs disengaged with a beep, the metal rings falling away and clattering onto the floor. Jess stayed on the floor for a long time, the cold metal pressed against her shins. The silence of the cell was absolute, save for the faint, rhythmic hum of the station's reactor core vibrating up through the deck plates. She crawled toward the steel bench and pulled herself up onto it. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around her shins. Her hands were a mess. Deep, jagged lacerations ran across her palms and fingers where the sharp ridges of Bronson's chitin had sliced through her skin. The cuts throbbed in time with her heartbeat. She pressed her face against her knees. She didn't cry. Crying was a waste of hydration and energy, a lesson drilled into her during the rationing years in Earth's lower sectors. Instead, she just shook. She shook violently, her teeth clicking together, her breath hitching in her chest. She had ripped a man's arm off. The memory replayed in a horrific, high-definition loop. The wet pop of the joint, the sound of tearing tendons, the impossible weight of the severed limb in her hands. She felt nauseous again, gagging on a dry stomach, spitting a string of bitter saliva onto the floor. She was going to the penal colonies, Xanthi Prime, the mining asteroid where the Coalition sent murderers and dissidents. No sunlight, no air that didn't taste like sulfur. I just wanted a paycheck, she thought, closing her eyes against the harsh glare of the cell's ceiling light. I just wanted out of the smog. She pulled her bleeding hands closer to her chest and waited for the executioner. The heavy lock mechanism of the cell door cycled exactly 4 hours and 22 minutes later. Jess knew this because she had been counting the automated ventilation cycles. The door slid open. The man who walked in was not a Coalition peacekeeper. He was human. He wore the immaculate slate-gray uniform of a Coalition administrator. The fabric was perfectly pressed, crisp and synthetic. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with salt and pepper hair cut close to his scalp and a face lined with deep, cynical grooves. He carried a sleek black datapad under his arm. Behind him, A small, multi-armed medical drone hovered into the room, its optical sensors clicking and whirring. The man stopped in the center of the cell. He looked at Jess. He looked at her matted hair, the dried, alien blood on her face, the blood-soaked front of her uniform and her mangled hands. His expression was completely unreadable. "Recruit Jessica Miller," he said. His voice was smooth, cultured, but lacking any warmth. "I am Colonel Harrison, Coalition Internal Security." Jess didn't stand up. She didn't uncurl from her defensive posture on the bench. She just stared at him, her eyes hollow. Harrison gestured with 2 fingers. The medical drone floated forward, extending a pair of metallic appendages. Jess flinched, pulling her hands back. "Let it work, Miller," Harrison said quietly. "If your wounds get infected with Drovian blood, your hands will rot off before your trial." Jess hesitated, then slowly extended her trembling, blood-caked hands. The drone sprayed a freezing, stinging foam over her palms. The pain was sharp enough to make her gasp, her vision flashing white. The foam hardened instantly into a flexible synthetic skin. Harrison dragged a foldable metal chair from a recess in the wall, opened it with a snap, and sat down opposite her. He placed the datapad on his lap and tapped the screen. A holographic projection flickered to life in the space between them. It was security footage from the gymnasium. Jess turned her head away. "Turn it off." "No." Harrison said, his tone mild but immovable. "Watch it. I know what happened. I was there. You experienced it, Miller. You don't understand it. Look at the projection." Reluctantly, Jess opened her eyes. The hologram showed her stepping into Bronson's strike. It showed her grabbing his wrist. "Commander Bronson weighs 640 pounds, Harrison said, his eyes flicking between the hologram and Jess's face. "His exoskeleton is composed of calcified keratin and heavy metals. His species evolved on a planet with a gravitational pull of roughly 0.6 Gs. They developed armor because their world is filled with things that want to eat them. They did not develop dense musculature." The hologram played forward in slow motion. Jess watched herself twist, watched her back arch, watched her boots dig into the mat. "Earth gravity is 1 G, Harrison continued. "Human bone density and muscle fiber are woven tightly together to keep us from collapsing under our own atmosphere. We are by galactic standards extraordinarily heavy for our size. We are dense." On the projection, Bronson's arm separated from his torso. A spray of dark fluid painted the air. Harrison paused the hologram on the exact frame where the arm tore free. Jess was screaming in the image, her face contorted into something feral and unrecognizable. "Physics," Harrison said, leaning back in his chair. "A lever, a fulcrum, and a violent application of torque. You used the floor, your own body weight, and his forward momentum. You generated over 1,200 pounds of tensile force in a span of 1.4 seconds. He tapped a button, and the hologram vanished. The cell felt darker without it. "Bronson's shoulder joint wasn't designed to withstand lateral torque," Harrison said. "You didn't just dislocate it. You tore the muscular skeletal anchor completely out of his thorax. He is currently in an artificial coma while surgeons attempt to graft a synthetic limb onto a wound cavity the size of a dinner plate." Jess swallowed. Her throat was bone dry. "Is he going to die?" "No, he is extremely resilient, just fundamentally altered." Harrison crossed one leg over the other. He folded his hands in his lap. "The medical and security boards want to classify you as a sociopathic anomaly. They want to ship you to the Xanthi Prime penal colony for unprovoked mutilation of a commanding officer." Jess looked down at her hands. The synthetic skin throbbed. It wasn't unprovoked. He was conducting a standard combat exercise. He was executing a kid, Jess said, her voice cracking. It was the first time she had spoken above a whisper. She cleared her throat, pushing through the exhaustion. Leo yielded. Bronson kept going. He was going to kill him to prove a point. Harrison tilted his head slightly. And what point was that? That humans are fragile, that we don't belong here, and your counter-argument was to dismantle him. Harrison sighed a dry, papery sound. You realize, Miller, that the Coalition prefers our fragility. They recruit humans for administration, for maintenance, for logistics. We are clever, adaptable, and small. We consume fewer resources. We are harmless. Harrison leaned forward, his eyes suddenly piercing, stripping away the bureaucratic facade. We do not advertise the fact that, stripped of our social conditioning and pushed into a corner, humanity is an apex pursuit predator from a death world. We do not advertise what happens when our biological limiters disengage. I didn't think, Jess whispered. He was hurting Leo, a pack-bonding response, triggering an adrenaline override. Harrison nodded. A fascinating, terrifying flaw in human neurology. You sacrificed your own physical integrity to neutralize a threat to a weaker pack member. He gestured toward her. Your latissimus dorsi is torn. You have hairline fractures in your lumbar vertebrae. You nearly broke your own spine to generate the force necessary to rip that arm off. Jess shifted on the bench, wincing as the pain in her back spiked to confirm his diagnosis. How is Leo? Harrison's face blanked out again. The warmth vanished. Recruit Leo Vance is in a somatic reweaver. 3 crushed ribs, punctured lung, severe internal bleeding. He will survive provided he remains in the tank for the next 2 weeks. A wave of relief so heavy it felt like a physical weight washed over Jess. She let out a long, shuddering breath, her head dropping back against the cold steel wall. He's alive. The idiot is alive. However, Harrison said, his voice cutting through her relief like a scalpel. A somatic reweaver costs 4,000 credits a day to operate. The Coalition does not cover catastrophic injuries resulting from a recruit's failure to properly execute a combat drill. Jess's eyes snapped open. The relief shattered, replaced by a cold, creeping panic. What number? Bronson broke the rules of engagement. Bronson is an instructor. Leo failed the physical parameters of the test. The Coalition bureaucracy is absolute, Miller. Harrison picked up his datapad. Leo's medical debt currently stands at 60,000 credits and climbing. Upon his discharge, if he cannot pay, he will be remanded to an indentured labor battalion to work off the debt. Given his lung damage, the labor will likely kill him within a year. Jess stared at him, her chest tightening until she couldn't pull air. Indentured. You can't do that. He's a Coalition citizen. He is a recruit from a lower-tier world, Harrison corrected softly. He has no rights until he completes basic training. Neither do you. Jess gripped the edge of the metal bench. The synthetic skin on her palms stretched taut. Then let me pay for it. Take my stipend. Put me in the labor battalion, Harrison chuckled. It was a dark, humorless sound. Your stipend is 300 credits a month, Miller. It would take you 16 years to pay off his current bill. And you aren't going to a labor battalion. You assaulted an officer. You are going to a maximum security penal asteroid. Jess felt the walls of the cell closing in. The sterile white light seemed to pulse. It was a trap. The whole system was a massive, unbreakable trap. You fight, you go to prison. You fall down, you get crushed by debt. There was no winning. There was just slow death or fast death. Unless, Harrison said, letting the word hang in the quiet air. Jess stopped breathing. She looked at him, Harrison swiped a finger across his datapad and slid it across the floor. It stopped right at the toe of Jess's boots. Unless, Harrison continued, we decide that the medical and security boards are wrong. Unless we decide that you aren't a sociopathic anomaly, but a highly valuable undocumented asset. Jess stared at the glowing screen of the datapad by her feet. It displayed a coalition contract, the text dense and looping. At the bottom was a glowing blue square waiting for a biometric thumbprint. "What is this?" she asked, her voice flat. "It is a transfer order," Harrison said. "You see, Miller, the coalition military has a problem. We fight wars against heavily armored, low-gravity species. We use heavy munitions, plasma artillery, and orbital strikes. But sometimes you cannot bomb a city block. Sometimes you need to clear a ship corridor. Sometimes you need to send infantry into close quarters." Harrison stood up and began to pace the small cell, his hands clasped behind his back. The standard heavy worlder infantry is large. They are slow in tight spaces. Their weapons are cumbersome. And as you so elegantly demonstrated today, they rely heavily on their natural armor, which makes them arrogant and inflexible in hand-to-hand combat. He stopped and looked down at her. "Internal security has been running a quiet initiative. We call it the Vanguard. We take humans, specifically humans, from the lower, harsher sectors of Earth. Humans who have learned to survive through violence. We equip them with kinetic dampeners, adrenaline boosters, and specialized breaching gear. And we drop them into the tightest, darkest, most miserable combat zones in the galaxy." Jess felt a cold sickness twist in her gut. She looked at the blood drying on her uniform. "You want to make me a shock trooper?" "I want to make you a weapon," Harrison corrected. "The Vanguard has a 70% casualty rate in the first year. It is brutal, horrific work, but it pays extremely well." He tapped his own wrist communicator. "If you sign that datapad right now, all charges against you regarding Commander Bronson are dropped. The incident is classified. More importantly, I will authorize a hazard pay advance. 80,000 credits deposited immediately into Recruit Vance's medical account. His debt is wiped. He wakes up clean, whole, and free to wash out of the academy and go back to Earth." Jess closed her eyes. The image of Leo's ruined chest armor flashed behind her eyelids, the wet crunch of his ribs snapping under Bronson's boot. He'll go home, she thought. He'll go back to the smog, but he'll breathe. He'll live. "And what happens to me?" she asked quietly. "You belong to the Vanguard," Harrison said. "You train, you drop, you fight. If you survive your 5-year tour, you earn full citizenship and a pension that will let you buy an island back on Earth. If you die knowing you saved your friend." Jess opened her eyes and looked at Harrison. He wasn't a savior. He was a vulture, picking through the wreckage of a tragedy to find a shiny new tool. He didn't care about Leo. He didn't care about justice for Bronson. He just saw a girl who could tear a limb off an alien, and he wanted to point her at his enemies. "I hate the military," Jess said. Her voice was raspy, stripped of any emotion. "I hate you. I hate this whole hypocritical meat grinder system. Your hatred is noted." "Miller," Harrison replied evenly. "It is also entirely irrelevant to the mathematics of your current situation. You have 60 seconds to sign, or I walk out that door and the guards come in to prep you for the penal transport." Jess looked down at her hands. The synthetic skin was a pale, glossy white, hiding the deep, bloody lacerations beneath. Her back screamed in agony as she slowly leaned forward. She reached down and picked up the datapad. The device felt cold and heavy in her hand. The text on the screen was a blur of bureaucratic legalese detailing terms of service, hazard waivers, and non-disclosure agreements. It didn't matter. None of the words mattered. It was a ransom note, pure and simple. She thought about the sparring mat. She thought about the smell of ozone and ammonia. She thought about the feeling of Bronson's arm giving way, the terrifying, intoxicating rush of absolute power that had flooded her brain when the limiters broke. She was scared of the aliens, yes, but sitting in this cold cell, holding the contract that would dictate the rest of her life, Jess realized she was much more terrified of herself. She pressed her right thumb against the glowing blue square. The datapad chimed softly, a pleasant synthetic ping that echoed loudly in the sterile cell. The screen flashed green. Biometric signature confirmed. Welcome to the Vanguard Specialist Miller. Harrison reached down and plucked the datapad from her loose grip. He tucked it under his arm. A pragmatic choice, Harrison said, turning toward the door. Wait, Jess said. Harrison paused, looking over his shoulder. The advance, Jess said, her eyes burning as she stared a hole into the steel floor. I want a confirmation. Now. I want to see the transfer to Leo's account. Harrison didn't argue. He pulled a smaller comms unit from his belt, tapped a few commands, and held it out. A small holographic projection showed a coalition banking ledger. An incoming transfer of 80,000 credits, time-stamped, perfectly applied to the medical debt of recruit Leo Vance. The balance read 0. Jess let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding since the gymnasium. He's clear, Harrison said, putting the unit away. He'll be discharged in 2 weeks. He will be told you washed out and went back to Earth early. Good, Jess whispered. Don't ever let him know where I am. Harrison nodded once. He stepped to the door and hit the release panel. The heavy blast door slid open, revealing the brightly lit corridor and the armed peacekeepers waiting outside. Medical will be here in 10 minutes to treat your back, Harrison said, not looking back. Get some sleep, specialist. Your dropship leaves at 0600. The door hissed shut, leaving Jess alone in the silence. She didn't lie down. She didn't try to sleep. She sat on the cold steel bench, staring at the synthetic skin on her palms, listening to the deep, rhythmic thrum of the station's reactor. It sounded like a heartbeat. A massive mechanical beast waking up in the dark, preparing to feed. The Vanguard didn't use dropships. They used insertion pods. The veterans called them coffins. Jess sat strapped into a gel-lined seat that smelled fiercely of chemical sanitizers and old vomit. The pod was a tungsten carbide cone, barely 10 feet across, designed to bypass orbital defense grids by mimicking the radar signature of a falling piece of space dock debris. It held 4 people. It had no windows. It had no life support beyond the recycled air, whistling through a single grimy vent near the ceiling. She stared at the back of the seat in front of her. The metal was scratched and scored with tally marks hastily carved by previous occupants, who were likely floating as frozen dust in some forgotten asteroid belt. Her own gear felt alien. It wasn't the standard bulky coalition armor. Vanguard suits were matte black, woven from synthetic spider silk and reinforced with carbon nanotube ribbing. It felt like a second skin clinging tightly to her muscles, compressing her chest just enough to make every breath a conscious effort. Heavy kinetic gauntlets encased her forearms, extending over her hands. Beneath the gauntlets, the synthetic skin on her palms still throbbed a dull, rhythmic ache that synced perfectly with the pulsing red standby light above the pod's hatch. Breathe, rookie, the voice crackled through the local comms bead in her ear. It belonged to Hale, the squad leader. He sat to her left, a massive slab of a human from the European mining colonies. His face was a road map of thermal burns, and he was chewing rhythmically on a strip of synthetic tobacco. The smell of peppermint and stale sweat permeated the cramped space. I'm breathing, Jess said. Her voice sounded thin. brittle. You're panting. A woman named Cortez chimed in from the front. She was sharpening a 12-inch serrated vibro blade against the edge of her knee plate, the screeching of metal on metal setting Jess's teeth on edge. Don't waste the oxygen. We got a 2-minute burn before the retro rockets kick in. You hyperventilate now. You'll black out when we hit the G-force wall. Leave her alone, Hale grunted. She tore Adrovian's arm off bare-handed. She's got the density. Jess closed her eyes. The story had spread. Of course it had. In the Vanguard, you weren't judged by your rank or your training. You were judged by your capacity for violence. They looked at her not as a traumatized kid from the lower sectors, but as a weapon that had successfully misfired. Target is a rogue Drovian mining platform. Hale continued, his tone shifting to business. The casual cruelty of the Vanguard. They stopped sending their tithe of palladium to the Coalition. Standard heavy worlder separatists. Big armored and slow. The gravity generators on the station are set to 0.4. They think it gives them the home field advantage. It makes them floaty. Cortez laughed. It was a harsh, jagged sound. Exactly, Hale said. We drop in, we breach the central command spine, we secure the atmospheric controls, and we put a kinetic slug in anyone who isn't wearing black. Do not try to match their strength. Shoot the joints. Shoot the eyes. If they get close, use your mass. The red light above the hatch turned yellow. A mechanical voice echoed through the pod. Drop sequence initiated. Warning. High velocity impact imminent. Brace. Injectors on, Hale commanded. Jess felt a sharp, icy prick at the base of her neck. The suit's auto-injector bypassed her nervous system, flooding her bloodstream with a military-grade cocktail of synthetic adrenaline pain inhibitors and oxygenated fluorocarbons. The rush was terrifying. The cold dread in her stomach instantly evaporated, replaced by a searing chemical fire that made her vision vibrate. Colors became impossibly sharp. The metallic tang in the air tasted like battery acid on her tongue. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not in panic, but like a perfectly tuned engine idling too high. Green light. The explosive bolts fired. The sound was deafening, a physical blow to the eardrums. The pod detached from the stealth cruiser. Gravity vanished for exactly 3 seconds. Jess felt her stomach float into her throat. Then the thrusters engaged. The acceleration was a physical assault. It felt like a concrete block was dropped onto her chest. Her jaw clamped shut. The gel seat hardened, molding to her spine to keep her vertebrae from snapping under the pressure. The pod shook violently, the tungsten hull screaming as it hit the upper atmosphere of the gas giant the station orbited. The temperature inside the pod spiked. Sweat instantly beaded on Jess's forehead, stinging her eyes, but she couldn't raise her hands to wipe it away. The G-force pinned her arms to her sides. 10 seconds! Hale roared, his voice barely audible over the roaring friction. Through the intense vibrations, Jess felt the mechanical clunk of the boarding harpoons deploying. Brace. The impact didn't feel like a landing. It felt like a car crash. The pod slammed into the hull of the Drovian station. The harpoons punched through the exterior plating, locking the pod in place. Sparks showered from the ceiling vent. The lights flickered or died, and were instantly replaced by the harsh, strobing white of the breach lights. Go, go, go. Hale unclipped his harness, his heavy kinetic rifle already raised. Jess hit the release. The harness snapped back. She practically fell forward, her boots hitting the grated floor of the pod. The front hatch blew outward with a concussive blast, tearing a hole through the station's inner hull. The smell of the breach hit her first. Scorched metal, burning polymer, and the sharp, undeniable scent of ammonia. Drovian territory. Jess racked the charging handle of her compact kinetic submachine gun. The weapon was heavy dense, firing depleted uranium slugs designed to shatter chitin. She stepped out of the pod and into the meat grinder. The corridor was a chaotic mess of torn cables and flashing emergency strobes. It was wide designed for the massive bipedal Drovians, which meant there was very little cover for a human. The gravity was disorienting. At 0.4 Gs, every step Jess took felt like walking on a trampoline. She had to actively force her boots down, using the magnetic clamps in the soles to anchor herself to the deck plates. "Contact front," Cortez yelled. Heavy thudding footsteps vibrated through the floorboards. From the intersection ahead, 3 Drovians rounded the corner. They were fully armored, their natural grey-blue plating supplemented by heavy bolted-on steel riggings. They carried plasma casters, brutal, unwieldy weapons that fired concentrated spheres of superheated gas. The air instantly superheated as the lead Drovian fired. A globe of blue plasma the size of a melon shrieked down the corridor. "Down!" Hale barked. Jess dove. Because of the low gravity, she didn't just fall. She launched herself, laterally slamming hard against the metal bulkhead. The plasmasphere missed her by inches. The heat radiated through her suit, instantly blistering the skin on her left shoulder. The sphere impacted the wall behind them, melting through the bulkhead with a blinding flash and a deafening hiss. Cortez didn't dive fast enough. A second plasmasphere clipped her thigh. The Vanguard suits were heat-resistant, but plasma burned at 5,000 degrees. The synthetic material flashed into vapor. Cortez screamed a ragged, horrifying sound that cut through the comms. She spun in the low gravity, her leg a charred, smoking ruin, and hit the deck hard. "Suppressive fire!" Hale roared, stepping out from the smoldering alcove and unloading his rifle. The heavy, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of human kinetic weapons filled the corridor. The depleted uranium slugs tore through the air. They struck the lead Drovian's chest plate. At standard gravity, the armor might have deflected the rounds. But here the physics favored the dents. The sheer kinetic transfer of the heavy slugs hitting the lighter mass alien threw the giant backward. Chitin shattered like cheap ceramic. Dark, viscous fluid sprayed across the walls. The Drovian fell its massive bulk, crashing into the 0G handrails. But there were 2 more. Jess's vision was a tunnel of hyper-focused clarity, courtesy of the combat stims. She didn't feel the burn on her shoulder. She didn't feel the terror. The drug stripped away the complex layers of human morality and left only the reptilian brain. Survive. Kill the threat. She pushed off the bulkhead using her dense leg muscles to propel herself forward in a low, flat trajectory that the aliens weren't used to tracking. The second Drovian tracked Hale, raising its plasma caster. Jess slid across the deck plates on her knees, the magnetic boots sparking against the metal. She raised her submachine gun and pulled the trigger. The recoil was massive, a jackhammer against her shoulder, but she held it steady. The burst of slugs took the Drovian in the knee joint, the weak point Hale had mentioned. The armor there was segmented to allow movement. The slugs chewed through the soft tissue. The alien roared, its leg buckling backward at a sickening angle. It collapsed the plasma caster, firing wildly into the ceiling, bringing down a shower of sparks and severed conduit pipes. "Clear right," Hale yelled, moving up to cover the intersection. Jess scrambled to her feet. The third Drovian had dropped its heavy weapon and charged. It was a tactic of desperation, relying on pure mass. The giant creature closed the distance in 3 massive strides, ignoring the low gravity, using the walls to push itself forward. Jess raised her gun, but the Drovian swatted it away with a massive armored forearm. The weapon clattered down the corridor. The alien lunged its huge, segmented hands, reaching for her throat. Jess didn't retreat. She remembered Harrison's voice in the cell. "You are an apex pursuit predator from a Deathworld." She dropped her center of gravity, anchoring her magnetic boots to the floor. As the Drovian's hands closed around her shoulders, attempting to lift her, Jess twisted. The alien's momentum carried it forward, expecting her to yield, expecting her to be light. But Jess was 140 pounds of dense bone and muscle anchored by electromagnets. She didn't yield. She became a concrete pillar. The sudden unexpected resistance threw the Drovian off balance. Its forward momentum was suddenly arrested by her anchored mass. Jess used the opportunity. She drove her heavy kinetic gauntlet upward, putting the entire kinetic force of her legs and waist into the uppercut. The carbon steel knuckles connected with the soft tissue under the Drovian's mandible. The impact was a wet, crunching sound. The force of a human strike, unimpeded by gravity limiters and fueled by synthetic adrenaline, was devastating. The alien's head snapped back with enough violence to crack its cervical vertebrae. It didn't scream, it just went limp. The massive body collapsed forward, burying Jess under 600 pounds of dead weight. She grunted, the breath forced out of her lungs. The smell of ammonia and copper flooded her helmet. She writhed her boots, slipping on the bloody deck plates, until she managed to wedge her knees under the alien's chest and push. She rolled the massive corpse off her, and lay on her back, staring up at the flickering emergency lights. The corridor was silent, save for the hum of the station's failing life support, and the wet, bubbling sound of Cortez breathing through the pane. Jess's hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the chemical cocktail burning through her veins. She looked at her gauntlets. They were coated in dark, sticky fluid. She had done it again. Without hesitation. Without thought. She had stepped into the violence and embraced it. The sickness she had felt in the academy gymnasium was gone, replaced by a cold, hollow efficiency. Miller. Hale's voice was rough. Get up. Check Cortez. Jess rolled onto her stomach and pushed herself up. Her muscles felt bruised, a deep, radiating ache beginning to seep through the pain inhibitors. She walked over to Cortez. The woman was pale, her teeth gritted so hard her gums were bleeding. The plasma burn had cauterized itself, but the tissue damage was catastrophic. Medfoam! Cortez hissed, her eyes wild. Jess unclipped a canister from her belt and sprayed the thick white foam over the ruined leg. It instantly hardened, stabilizing the limb and injecting a local anesthetic. Can you walk? Jess asked. Her voice was flat, emotionless. She didn't recognize it. No, Cortez spat. Leave me. Hold the corridor. The extraction shuttle is 10 minutes out. We don't leave people, Jess said. The words tasted like ash. Did she mean it? Or was she just reciting the pack bonding instinct that had doomed her in the first place? Hale stepped over the body of the Drovian Jess had killed. He looked down at the crushed jaw, then looked at Jess. His expression was unreadable beneath the grime and thermal burns. You hold the left flank, Miller, Hale ordered. They know we're here now. The whole station is going to converge on this spine. We hold for 10 minutes. Jess picked up her submachine gun from the floor. She checked the magazine. Half empty. She slapped a fresh one in the metallic clack, echoing sharply. She walked to the intersection, stepping over the spreading pool of alien blood. She leaned against the scorched bulkhead, raising her weapon, and stared into the dark, flashing corridor. She wasn't a girl from the lower sectors anymore. She wasn't a recruit looking for a paycheck. She was a vanguard. And as the heavy thudding footsteps of the next wave began to vibrate through the floorboards, Jess realized the most terrifying truth of all. She wasn't afraid. The extraction shuttle smelled remarkably like the drop pod, just with the added layers of burnt ozone, scorched blood, and the sharp chemical tang of medical foam. Jess sat on a metal bench, staring at the floor. The shuttle was vibrating violently as it broke orbit, the inertial dampeners struggling against the massive gravitational pull of the gas giant below them. The mission was over. The orbital controls had been sabotaged, the Drovian garrison decimated, and the remaining separatists left to suffocate as the station's life support slowly bled out into the vacuum of space. It was a total operational success. Cortez was strapped into a medical stasis pod in the corner, unconscious, her heart rate a steady, rhythmic blip on a monitor. Hale sat across from Jess, stripping his rifle with practiced mechanical efficiency. He hadn't said a word since they boarded. The combat stims were wearing off. The crash was always worse than the high. Jess felt it start at the base of her skull, a cold, creeping ache that spider-webbed down her spine. Her muscles began to twitch uncontrollably. Her skin felt like it was shrinking, pulling tight over her bones. The pain inhibitors dissolved, and the blistered burn on her left shoulder roared to life, a searing agony that made her want to vomit. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, and buried her face in her hands. The heavy kinetic gauntlets had been removed. She was looking at her bare hands again. The synthetic skin over her palms was stained a dirty grayish-brown. The edges were peeling slightly, revealing the angry red lacerations underneath. They didn't look like human hands anymore. They looked like tools, implements of blunt force trauma. A small hollow projector, bolted to the center of the ceiling, hummed to life. The blue light flickered, resolving into the crisp upper half projection of Colonel Harrison. He was sitting at a desk, a steaming cup of something in his hand. He looked incredibly comfortable. Vanguard Actual. This is internal security. Harrison's smooth voice filled the cabin. Confirming extraction and mission success. The station's orbit is decaying. Splendid work, Squad 7. Hale didn't look up from his rifle. Cortez lost a leg. We need immediate medivac upon docking. Noted, Sergeant Hale. A medical team is standing by. Harrison said, his tone perfectly calibrated to express professional sympathy without a drop of actual emotion. His holographic eyes shifted to Jess. Specialist Miller, your biometric telemetry during the breach was exceptional. You neutralized 2 heavily armored hostiles in close quarters. You adapted quickly to the environment. Jess didn't look at the hologram. She just stared at her dirty hands. You proved my hypothesis. Miller. Harrison continued, taking a sip from his cup. You are exactly what the Coalition needs. A scalpel wrapped in a sledgehammer. Turn him off, Jess whispered. Hale paused his cleaning, glancing up at her. You survived day 1, Specialist, Harrison said, either not hearing her or choosing to ignore it. Only 1,824 days left on your contract. Get some rest. Harrison out. The hologram blinked off. The silence in the shuttle returned, heavy and suffocating. Jess reached into a small waterproof pouch strapped to her thigh. She pulled out a heavily encrypted, civilian-grade datapad. It was contraband, smuggled onto the stealth cruiser by a corrupt quartermaster who charged her 3 months' worth of hazard pay for it. She powered it on. The screen cracked slightly, the backlight bleeding through the edges. She opened a secure routing network, bypassing the military firewalls, and logged into a public coalition registry. She typed in a name. Leo. The search wheel spun for a grueling 10 seconds. Then a profile populated. It showed a recent discharge photograph. Leo looked pale, his face gaunt dark circles under his eyes. He was wearing civilian clothes, a cheap synth cotton jacket. The medical notes attached to his file were brief, severe thoracic trauma, reconstructed via somatic reweaver, full recovery expected, honorable discharge. Below that, his current location pinged. Earth, Sector 4, Transit Hub 8. He was home. He was breathing real air or whatever passed for it in the smog-choked lower sectors. He was out of the meat grinder. He was safe. Jess stared at the tiny image of his face. She traced the edge of the screen with a trembling, blood-stained thumb. She felt a tear break loose, tracking a hot, stinging path through the grime and dried sweat on her cheek. It tasted like salt and copper. She didn't wipe it away. It was the only real thing she had felt in hours. She had saved him. She had paid the debt. But as she looked from Leo's face back to her own hands, she understood the true cost of Harrison's bargain. The Coalition didn't just buy her service, they bought her humanity. They had taken the pack bonding instinct, the very thing that made humans empathetic, the instinct that drove her to step between a friend and a monster, and weaponized it. They had turned her into the monster so Leo could remain human. Jess powered down the datapad. The screen went black, reflecting her own exhausted, hollow eyes. She slipped it back into a pouch. She leaned her head back against the vibrating bulkhead of the shuttle, closed her eyes, and let the cold, mechanical rhythm of the engines carry her toward the next war. If you felt the bone-crunching reality of Jess's journey and want more gritty HFY sci-fi stories that explore the raw, untamed nature of humanity, don't let this transmission fade into the dark hit that like button to support the Vanguard. Share this video with your squad and subscribe to the channel for more immersive Deathworld tales every week. Sound off in the comments below. Would you have signed Harrison's contract to save a friend? Let the algorithm know humanity doesn't back down. See you in the next drop, recruits.